Hello and welcome to Knife Chats. Today I'm going to be looking at this knife here. This is the Pal RH-36, and the knife has an interesting story to it, and I thought I'd share it with you. So let's begin with talking a little bit about Pal Blade Company and how it became Pal Cutlery Company. Originally, Pal Blade Company, I believe, was just making straight razors and a few other things. And then in January of 1941, the Remington Company, Remington, the rifles, the ammunition and everything, they also made knives at one time. And they were making their own knives in the, I believe, the 20s, the 30s, and all the way up to 1941, January of 1941. And in January of 1941, basically, with the buildup of World War II beginning and getting contracts through Lend-Lease and everything, Remington decided to sell off its knife company so it could concentrate on making ammunition, because the real money was in ammunition and they were really moving forward with that. And so they ended up selling their entire cutlery division off to Pal. And so that happened in January of 41, and Pal moved all of the Remington stuff, their tool and dies, their production equipment, their old stock, everything, lock, stock, and barrel, to a different state and everything else. And it took them about 2 months to get up and running. So by March or April, Pal Blade Company was now also making a bunch of old Remington pattern knives. And one of the knives they were making was this one here, the RH-36. This began life in the Remington line as an RH-36 by Remington. That's what the R is in there for, because it was a Remington knife. Pal would also go on to make other knives of their own pattern, but for the most part, what Pal mainly was making was knives that Remington had made originally. And so that brings us to the RH-36. So somewhere around March or April of 1941, Pal started making these knives, and you see here, you see a new tank stamp on there. It's no longer Remington, it's Pal, but you still see RH-36 on there. And they were making basically hunting knives. But then there's this thing that happens on December 7th, 1941, and the Japanese bombing Pearl Harbor basically said there's this war that's going to start, and all of a sudden all the branches of the military needed, besides guns and ammunition, new tanks and everything else, they were also looking to knife makers to produce all sorts of knives for them, and they were scrambling for knives because they really did not have a standard knife in December of 1941, or at least a quality standard knife for the branches of service. That would not actually show up until the end of 1942, beginning into 1943. And so enters the RH-36, which was a good solid hunting knife, and that's really what they were looking for, a good solid hunting knife. In this case, one with a 6-inch blade and about a 5-inch handle. It's about 11 inches overall. I'll put in the exact dimensions. And the people who actually wanted the RH-36 was the Army Air Corps. This is the knife that they wanted to put in with their emergency kit, and also for pilots and such. And a strange thing with it is they asked for both left and right-handed sheaths for these knives. Now that might sound kind of weird at the beginning, but it makes sense in the long run. And if you notice, this is a left-handed sheath. It would go on your left side instead of your right side. And the reasoning behind that was you're going to have, if you notice also, it's just got slots for a belt. This is not going on web gear or anything, because pilots and air crew don't wear web gear. They just have a belt on their pants. So this is going to be worn on their side, underneath their heavy flak gear and all that other stuff, out of the way. And then on their right hip would be a pistol. So, when they have to bail out or something, they've got their pistol on one hip, their knife on the other hip. Or it would just be thrown into the emergency bailout gear, and when you end up bailing out grabbing your emergency gear, once again you strap the knife on your left hip and the pistol on your right hip. And that's why they ask for both left and right-handed sheaths with these. And hold on just a second. This was also why when the Army ended up adopting the M3 trench knife with the soldiers, there's a thunderstorm going on outside. In any case, when the Army decided to choose this knife for their soldiers and such, one of the selling points was it didn't really matter if you wore the knife on the left side or the right side, because you can put it in the sheath either way. And so, and if you notice, this blade is used throughout the entire series of M4, M5, M6, M7 bayonets. And with the MH sheath, it's the same thing as the M6 sheath here. You can put the knife in either way. And that's one of the selling points of this, is you don't have to worry if you're going to have it on your left hip or your right hip. In the case of these knives, you needed a purpose-built sheath for either left or right-hand carry, and so the Army Air Force actually ordered both types of sheaths in about equal numbers. There might have been a few more right-handed sheaths. And that's one of the ways you can also kind of tell that this knife was made during the war, even though it's got a nice shiny blade. They did have some Parkerized blades, but they only did that in 1 year, and that was in 1943. And even during that time, most of the blades ended up just being a regular shiny blade. The Parkerization was not that critical as far as the Army Air Corps was concerned. They just wanted the knives. But after 1944 or so, they ended up going with a loop style sheath instead of the slots for the belt. So you'd have a nice loop here to pass your belt through. Something that costs a little bit more, but works a little bit better and holds different types of belts, and also is less prone to ripping and tearing. So if you got one with the cheaper sheath, then it was probably one that was, at least the sheath was probably one that was made during World War II and under contract for the United States Army Air Force. About the knives though, like I mentioned before, see the tang stamp here where it says Pal and then RH-36. All of the fixed blade knives, or at least all of the RH-36, have that tang stamp. In 1946, I believe, Pal changed their tang stamps on their pocket knives, but they did not change them on their fixed blades. So chances are, if you have an RH-36, it was probably made during the war for the Army Air Corps, because that's when the bulk of the Pal RH-36 were made. And that leads me to kind of summing this all up. After World War II ended, Pal was left with a whole lot of canceled contracts from the U.S. government, so they had a lot of backstock that they also had to sell. So even though they changed their tang stamp in 1946, they were continuing to use the older tang stamp even on their pocket knives and stuff, because the blades were already stamped. What are you going to do, throw them away, melt them down and go through the process? No, you're just going to go ahead and use them. Camillus did the same thing. They changed their tang stamp in 1944, but they continued to use the older tang stamp well up into almost 1950. So you can't really date the knives saying, oh, I got a 4-line Camillus or I've got an old Pal tang stamp, and assume that the knife was actually made during the war. It could have still been made after the war. And in the case of this knife, the tang stamp never changed. So this could just as easily have been made as late as 1953 when Pal finally closed its doors. However, chances are that's not the case, and I'll explain why. One of the saving graces for the Pal Blade Company was World War II. If the war had not gone on, I mean, one of the reasons Remington was dumping his knife line was because it wasn't as profitable as you'd think it would have been. And Pal picked it up, World War II happened, suddenly they have all sorts of knives they need to sell because they've got a government contract. The government contract is calling for all these knives. Pal starts going from 2 shifts a day to 3 shifts a day. They're having to expand, build new factories and everything else to meet production numbers for the U.S. government because it was a lucrative government contract and they were making money off of it. But then suddenly in August 1945, peace breaks out and all sorts of government contracts start getting canceled and everything. And Pal is left holding all sorts of old product. And what's worse, the Army Air Force, it's going towards a new knife, and it's got a bunch of these, and they're just dumping them on the surplus market. So suddenly, there's all sorts of surplus RH-36 knives out there that are selling for much cheaper than you're ever going to get from Pal straight away from the factory, and many of them had not even been used. All they've been doing is sitting in an emergency pack. The Air Force goes and dumps them all, and Pal is left holding the bag. The sales for these start dropping dramatically, as well as all their other pocket knives, because there's a glut of all those knives out there on the market because the war's over. Military surpluses all over the place. Soldiers came home with their own knife, known as the demand just isn't there. And that's probably what led to the demise of Pal in 1953, because they didn't pick up any new contracts during the Korean War that started in 51. So it's kind of a strange thing. The war gave them the ability to actually build and expand, but then peace forced them to cut their losses and eventually close. But in any case, there's the RH-36, wonderful little knife. It's got a aluminum pommel, it's got a metal, probably a 1095 carbon steel cross guard, 6-inch 1095 carbon steel blade, stacked leather handle with spacers. You see the pin right there, and got the fuller up here, which is great for holding on to because it was just a hunting knife. Sharp edge up on top and sharp edge down here. And like I said, the early ones came with either a left or right-handed sheath, and it really doesn't matter that it was a left-handed sheath. They were also being used in the Air Force at the time, either sheath. So there you have a little bit of history about another knife used by the Army Air Force during World War II. Oh, and on a side note, the RH-35 was also used, but that was mainly used by the United States Navy. And the United States Navy RH-35s will be stamped normally with USN, but they also use some that were not stamped. They may have also used the RH-36. The RH-36 is a little bit bigger than the RH-35, but as far as I know, the United States Army Air Force only used the RH-36 in the Pal line, and they're not stamped USAAF or USAAC. They're just stamped Pal, Pal, USA, made in USA. You know, that's the way it was. The Navy and the Marine Corps felt the need to actually brand their knives so that it was marked for the Navy, marked for the Marines, but the Army and the U.S. Army Air Force did not do that. So that's why you don't see a bunch of knives out there that are stamped Army or stamped Air Force or anything. They just never did it during World War II. The one exception would be if you ever see those scout knives that say USA on it, on the shield. That USA actually stands for United States Army as opposed to United States of America, but the confusion is so rampant that it's almost hardly worth mentioning. But if you see USA on the little scout knives, chances are that was United States Army. And that's why you see the later metal ones, the demo knives, they're just stamped US because everyone used them. Thank you so much for joining us. I hope you enjoyed this episode of Knife Chats, and if you did, please like and share it with your friends. Comments are always welcome. Don't forget to subscribe and ring that notification bell so you'll know when the next episode of Knife Chats is up online. Thanks again. Hope to see you soon.